Great, fantastic. Yeah, we'll share this mic, don't worry, yeah. So I'm going to ask each of our speakers to briefly introduce themselves and tell us how they interface with the regulatory agencies of their countries. Abu?
Thank you very much. My name is Aboubakar Haman. I work for Axian Group. We are a Pan-African group of telecom companies. We have operations in a few number of countries. We have currently 7 MNOs across Africa. We do operate in Tanzania under Tigo. We have also other activities like Tawaco of Africa is one of our subsidiaries. And we do have also cloud services that we offer through Stellarix. So to answer to your question, how do we interact with regulators in general? We tend to have constructive and to build constructive relationship with regulator. We tend to have continuous engagement with them. We spend a lot of time to understand their needs and to try as much as possible to adapt ourselves also to their requirement. We actually participate in all our footprints where applicable to the call for comments. We try to give our input whenever there is a question that is raised by the regulators. And we try as much as possible to participate in their working groups to build a kind of transverse collaboration with them, and as well as with other players, the policymakers, and the entire telecom ecosystem. We believe that, in our view, we believe that it's important to have this collaboration. I think, and maybe I will develop that later. We need to move from a very prescriptive regulatory approach to really a more collaborative approach with the whole ecosystem and mainly with the MNOs.
My name is Sutherland. I'm the divisional exec for a vertically specialized software development division of a company called AdaptIT, who's part of the bigger Valaris group or the bigger Constellation group. So I suppose everybody's wondering, what is a software developer sitting here talking about regulatory requirements? So we develop, one of the platforms that we develop assists mobile network operators to actually monitor and manage their compliance to the various regulations that are actually laid down by the regulators. We're also engaged with the regulators, obviously, to be able to provide the best value for our customers. And also regulators are out in the market quite often looking for platforms that can help them to manage and monitor. And so we're kind of, I would say, a bit of an independent party sitting in the middle and watching the fight that happens on both sides. And I think I agree with Aboubakar here. It's a little bit of collaboration, I think a lot more transparency. This life can become a lot easier for both. And I think it will also help with moving forward and getting a lot more people connected.
Thanks, Steve. Let's hear from Tuhair now. Tuhair, what's Zanzibar Research Center doing in this space, and can you share some of your findings and what you work with regulators?
Thank you. My name is Tuhair. Like I said, my background is financial economics, and I used to work for the government of Tanzania as a regulator of pension and health insurance, and also advise the government in these areas. Currently, I'm working with Zanzibar Research Center for Social Economic and Policy Analysis, and we basically engage in generating evidence to inform the policy decision making. And we are among the engagement that we are currently pursuing is that we are working with the ministry responsible for ICT to develop, to review the national Zanzibar policy, and in particular, in collaboration with the UNCDF and Tony Blair Foundation, to trying to incorporate the issue related to the private sector. And similarly, we are working closely with our government partners to ensure inclusiveness of community in the digital platform and ICT. So, of course, we are looking at trying to balance the issues that's all business. It's the kind of always a key, a standing out issue of the policy should engage on the enabling environment. But when you go deep down, there's also other issues of how you protect the right of minority individuals who are not knowledgeable, how you extend inclusiveness, how you look at the cost and all other issues. So this is the fundamentals area that we're looking at. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's begin with you again for the next question. My next question for you is, which countries have you seen as being very open to regulation, which have very favorable regulations for the industry? What are some good practices you're seeing, best countries for regulations?
Of course, I'll refer to the environment which you're more familiar with. So I would say not more of the country, but as an economy, Zanzibar has very kind of investors-friendly regulation. And maybe might raise the question, is it too friendly or not? But now it's basically that this industry is, the position of the government is to let the private sector lead. And also in Tanzania, as a United Republic, it's also going toward the same direction that now, there's this acceptance that ICT and digital transformation is growing so exponentially. So it's almost impossible to control everything, but maybe to focus on the key aspect that's really need the regulation and monitoring and let the private sector thrive. So I will stick my reference to current political environment in Tanzania. I think it's very conducive to.
Great, it's conducive, fantastic. Steve, when you look across Africa, what do you see on your scorecard? Which countries seem to be really notable, outstanding?
I think those that are comparable, if we look first of all at rest of world, you'll see the ones that pop up are Singapore, Estonia. I think we all know why they're sitting up there, South Korea, UAE, Denmark, Finland, those ones, how they drive. And a lot of that is because it's a lot of open collaboration, shared stakeholders on both sides. But if we do come a little bit closer to home, Kenya, birthplace of M-Pesa, we saw what that did, especially to the economy, making them all-inclusive and being able to use cell phones to be able to buy. Saw what that did just in terms of mobile money. But yeah, Rwanda, Nigeria, South Africa to some degree. We've been hearing all about Tanzania and Zanzibar, the great strides that they've been making. But yeah, there's always a couple of leaders. But I think the important thing to note is that if you look at all of these countries that I've mentioned, yes, there are similarities, but you'll find that they're kind of sitting at the top there for different reasons. The government has driven different objectives. It's either e-commerce related, or it's inclusive, or e-government. And the regulators are helping the governments to kind of drive that. And I think the problem is you find that in those countries where you don't see that, there is no shared stakeholder. So you find that the government is driving an objective. The MNOs are obviously driving profitability because their shareholders want that. And you find that because of that lack of collaboration, sometimes they're pulling in different directions and you're not achieving a common goal.
Aboubakar, what do you see when you look across the African landscape?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's very difficult to basically classify countries in terms of regulatory environment. What we can say is that you can see in all countries good practices that some good practices actually that promote transparency, that promote innovation, that promote efficiency. I think the case of Tanzania was cited, and I want to commend for example, the 5G frequency allocation process that was very transparent and was that led to actually having spectrum at very fair prices and very transparent condition. I think there are some other good practices that also can be commended across Africa. We have, for example, in West Africa, in Togo, in the country in which we are operating, the regulator is experimenting data-driven regulation. Basically, they want, the leverage on data collection, on the availability of data, to drive regulation. And this is done principally on quality of service, for example. So the regulator will gather a lot of data on operators' network, and ultimately will empower the customers with those information. And what is interesting is that they also tend to work with the other players in the ecosystem, the consumer association. Those people can also feed, the information system with their information. The result is that the customer is really informed on a real-time, almost real-time basis about the quality of their network and the other networks as well in their neighborhood, around their work, on their way to work, etc. And it gives them really the capacity, beside the price, to choose the best network. And ultimately is something that incentivizes competition. So in Togo, they're at the early stage, but you have more mature. I mean, if you look at Europe, for example, this model is very mature and very successful in France, for example. So I think this practice could be something that can be scaled, across Africa and replicated by other regulators. I believe that we need to move definitely to an incentive regulation rather than a very prescriptive approach made with sanctions and requirement, etc. We need really to involve all the players and push regulation to incentivize competition between the main players.
That's a great recommendation. In fact, one theme that's been coming up in many of the previous sessions is we need to accelerate the speed at which cooperation is happening. So my question for each one of you is, what are some of your recommendations to the audience on how to get industry and regulator and governments to work together much faster? Because there's a lot of impatience out there among consumers, among businesses to get access and reliable services and so on much faster. So how would you suggest we speed up this whole game? Aboubakar?
Yes, so I think it's collaboration is key, is the key word, and regulators should engage, on a continuous basis with all the players in order to get the industry view in whatever they want to start or to engage in. So I think this is very key, putting in place a transparent, collaborative environment with all the key stakeholders in order to get their views. It's important also to benchmark itself for regulators. They need to benchmark themselves because I think it's sometimes the view and the perception that we operators have is that regulators, they don't question themselves about what they're doing. So it's important that they also benchmark themselves and see if what they are doing is really among the best practice. There's also one thing that is very key in my view, and that is not done yet by our regulators in our countries, and I would suggest that maybe we move to that approach, is doing regulatory assessment. I mean, basically, when we enact regulations in countries, it's important before enacting the regulation to do a proper impact assessment to see what would be the output of this regulation. And along the way, when the regulation is enacted, it's important also to do that assessment in order to adjust if the initial objectives are not met. So basically, if we want to have this conducive environment, I think those elements might be key, in my view. Thanks.
Maybe just a little bit further to it, I was saying I agree with him 100%. I think both parties need to understand what transparency can actually bring to them. But also, I think right in the beginning, the communications needs to be a little bit more open and collaborative. So it needs to start off with open and collaborative communications, and so that they share a goal. We've been hearing for the last 2 days about the shared goals, about getting connectivity to those that don't have. So that needs to be one. The regulatory framework needs to be clear, and there needs to be an understanding on both sides. And I think there's possibly some education required also on both sides. So regulators need to understand how quickly technology changes and how they also need to be able to change with that. And we've been working in analytics on the networking side for about 20 years, so we know just how rich that information is. And we know that from talking to a lot of the regulators, they battle to monitor the effectiveness of the regulation because they look at the wrong things. And therefore they're very slow to understand what the actual impact of the regulations are that they've written on the actual growth of the industry, because it's not always linked to technology. It's usually linked to some financial aspect. And so the consumer welfare is actually getting affected because of these many things. And there's what we're trying to encourage is we understand that there's a fear. So what we're trying to see if we can initiate is regulatory sandboxes, where they create a sandbox in a controlled environment where the network operators can innovate with some maybe relaxed regulations so that both parties can actually see where this thing's going to go. And I think it's also maybe speaking a little bit to what Bradley spoke about, is we've been doing this for 14 years and things aren't moving. And a lot of the reasons why they're not moving is because everybody's too scared just to let go on the piece of string a little bit because they don't know where it's going to go. But there are systems available and you can monitor these things.
Thanks. I will look on the other side of the coin, so of course, and bring more independent views. So regulators, there are a lot of regulatory issues to be addressed, and this will always be the case because the environment we are living in change. But there are two key issues which I think are very crucial. The first is incentive. I did hear a lot about empowerment and partnership, well and good, but most, I believe, the core fundamental, reason for all this, most companies to exist is to maximize profits. That's the fundamental reason. And if you look at practice, at least in Tanzania and many African countries, there's a lot of ICT infrastructure investment and digital transformation in government entities and corporate. Why? Because the funds are there. It's very basic. There's no two ways about it. It's where, the profits are there. So the key question is then the other segment, which is left behind, how can it, be integrated first? And I think the main takeaway for me is to, whatever you're doing, I'm not expert in ICT, but to look in a holistic picture. For instance, like ICT and digital transformation can help to lessen asymmetric of information challenge. And when you do that, of course, the access to financing will be broader, many people will be bankable, access to capital in this, and the economic outcomes of people will grow. So at the moment, I think most of the efforts are being pushed, including the policy, without looking at the all dynamics of economics and social context. Yes, thank you.
Great. I got a couple of questions more, but I want to open up the floor to the audience, and this is our last panel of the conference. Any questions, comments from the audience? I don't see Bradley, but he normally... Conveniently, I can't see you. Anyway, yeah. Can we get a mic to our friend over here? There's no one. I'll get it.
Okay, thank you very much. My question is, from the beginning we are talking about regulations being as obstacles in accessing and affordability. So I'm asking the guy who Zanzibar regulator, what do you think about this, and what do you comment? Because we always know they are checking, the problem is the regulations on our countries that related to our pricing on accessing data is very expensive. So what is your view?
No. First, I'm not from a regulatory authority, but I can ask from research and policy analysis perspective. Of course, always, like I said, there's an issue about regulatory, but tax, it's more also of an administrative issue. And so the key argument then is if the tax is a major constraint that limit connectivity coverage, then how will the any lacks or change in taxation will not come to corporates, will benefit people. And this is often the challenge we're facing in our economy. So it's not clear to the society, and now I'm bringing the voice of people that, okay, if there's any tax or any whatever, it will benefit, it go directly to eradicate or lessen the challenge than making profit. So I believe that, the industry is thriving, and it's thriving and continue growing, maybe not so rapidly, because there are profitability, that's obvious. But then how when you go to other issues to extend inclusiveness, it can be directly pinned to the beneficiaries of such policy issues. So it's not the policy, it's not necessarily broad that touches everyone. Then there are specific issues, and it was touched before, that needs a thorough analysis to justify for a certain move. So my point is that, of course, there are regulatory issues, and like most economies, it took time for digital transformation and ICT, usage to come up to a high speed, and we are making that progress. But it's not necessarily all the issues are pertaining to regulatory or policy issues. That's my point. There are issues pertaining to business model and lack of domestic capital that makes everything, cost of doing business, relatively high in Tanzania than in Europe. So that's why, of course, the business will pass that cost to the consumer. It's as simple as that. Then the question is how we make cost of doing business low. Yes, thank you.
Any other questions?
We can take one last one before we wrap
one in
up.
the front, Madad.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Mwita Bedastas. I just wanted to know the view of all the panelists in terms of creating sustainability on service being offered by different providers. On the regulatory point of view, in a situation where the government is not having any operations as on service delivery, what's your view in terms of adding an element of MNOs or ISP or other operators being contribute a little bit, whereby if any of the operator is out of the business, on the verge of being out of the business, either by competition or any change in technology, then the regulator should be able to bail out, kind of a bailing out fund, so that to ensure sustainability of service to the community, especially on the areas where the government doesn't have a direct operations in terms of providing services. What is your view on that?
Any comments on that? The bailout fund, the reserve, a buffer. Yeah, Steve.
I think it should start before that. It shouldn't get to the point where a bailout is required. And I think it's one of the reasons why we're trying to push for the transparency, because if regulators and government were aware of a particular mobile network operator having operational inefficiency, that it should be addressed at that point. So that should be one of the points of regulation. If a network fails, there's probably not even a chance that a bailout will be able to assist, or it's going to cost a lot more. It will probably be a cost to the government a lot less, or the MNO a lot less, if that corrective action happens a lot quicker. And so therefore, having visibility of what's going on, I think if there is a helping hand, it should be to extend the network into the areas where they don't have, which will also help with the sustainability.
Yes, so on that, I think the role of the regulator is actually to ensure that you have a level playing field on the market, and to ensure that competition works effectively. So basically, if competition works effectively, I mean, there are some, I think in a market economy, there are things that happen, and it's difficult, I mean, to view it. What is important, in my view, is really the end customer at the end of the day, because the objective is really to make sure that services are provided efficiently to the end customer. So thinking about a bailout fund for operators that might not be able to achieve or to provide services so on a sustainable basis. I think in a market economy, I don't know, maybe these things happen on exceptional basis, but I think that normally if the market is well regulated, there are some safeguards. The regulator looks at anti-competitive practices and make sure that they are banned from the market. So if there is a bailout fund, it means that there is a whole market failure. So, and then in that case, maybe state intervention can happen, which was done maybe in other markets for banks, etc. But in a market economy, I don't think it's something that we can think of at the first instance, in my view.
Tuhair, what does your research show about risks in regulation and some ways of de-risking it, either the form of a bailout fund or something else?
Because this is a very basic. It hasn't worked well in the banking sector simply because of moral hazard, and I'm not convinced it's going to work in your industry as well. And it has been well explained that bailout is a last result, and for such industry that's in the stage where it is in, one should not really think of a bailout. I think also more pertaining to this, maybe a little bit to this question, is the issue of crowding out effects, which I think it's a serious danger in your industry because the government, especially in Africa, because of this delay, they're investing quite a lot in this area, and it might, keep away private investors. Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. We've got just a few more minutes before the minister comes for the closing ceremonies and so on. I have just one last question for a panel, which is, what are some of your future plans? And if you come back here next year, where would we be, and how can maybe regulation help you get where you want to be even faster?
Okay, thank you. So, as most MNOs, our immediate, objective is to increase our data penetration, and the virtue of having data penetration increase were explained in the earlier panel. I think it's one of the key elements that we are working on as an operator today. We want, of course, to push that penetration to highest extent in our market. And of course, regulation is really key to achieve this target specifically. We, of course, we're expecting regulation to provide us with the spectrum because we have mobile operations in most of our market, and of course to provide us with the right spectrum and at a fair price and true transparent processes for 5G rollout. And even today, we're expecting also regulation to have, to think about the reuse of spectrum, of 2G and 3G spectrum. You know that we are talking a lot about 2G and 3G sunset, to move to 4G and 5G. So this reuse of spectrum, what they call refarming, it's a process that has to be discussed, I think, or initiated by regulation. And from a general perspective, what is important is also to think about technology neutrality. I think this will help, of course, the operators to roll out their broadband services. And one of the key things that is also that we need to think of today, and I think Tanzania has taken a lot of measures with regards to the right-of-ways that will certainly encourage the rollout of FTTH in the coming years. I think it's a good step to have affordable prices for FTTH and of course, a very positive rollout in the coming years. One of the plans that we have also is mobile financial service to increase the access to financial service. It was said before that we are lagging, Africa is lagging behind with regards to financial service. I think the world penetration rate is 20%. So it's something that we aim to increase significantly in our footprint. And of course, favorable regulations are key to achieve that. We hope to have, of course, a competition, a proper competition law introduced in that framework, because what we see, for example, in West Africa is that central banks generally don't apply competition law and I think it's a pity, because we have seen various markets where we had significant issues with new entrants. So it's important that competition rules, market competition rules are taken into account also into that segment. And we think also that one important thing is to work towards interoperability. Interoperability between MNOs, interoperability between financial services across the whole ecosystem. Because in some countries, it's something that is working effectively, but I think in many, many countries, it's lacking today. Thank you.
I'm hoping that in a year's time we've been able to familiarize a lot more of regulators with the technology that's actually available, because we also found that in speaking to them, sometimes a lot of the reasons why they hold back on initiatives is they don't know how it can be measured, and therefore their risk mitigation is potentially just avoiding it in the first place. And I think quite a few of the speakers have already spoken about public-private partnerships, they've spoken about incentive programs, they've spoken about all of these, but if you can't measure and monitor, sometimes the safest thing is not to do anything. So I think if we can in a year's time at least have been able to show and demonstrate to the regulators that there is the technology out there that will allow them to be able to monitor these things, that will be able to accommodate transparency, that will allow them to actually monitor and measure the subscribers' quality of service, which is what they're trying to achieve in the first place, then I think we'll be able to move a little bit quicker.
Thank you. My wish will be to translate this log and meaningful connectivity into a real effect that's kind of transformed people, social and economic outcomes, and in particular through pricing, because it was mentioned that Finland and Denmark, these countries have high-level connectivity, but also the pricing in those countries has been gone down significantly with time. But here in Tanzania and many economies in Africa, that hasn't been the case, to be honest. So be it operational issues that a corporate are looking at the profitability, or policy issue or regulatory issues, but the key thing will be to use pricing to achieve your ambitions. Thank you.
So just to wrap up, we've had a lot of discussion on metrics and ROI and all over the last couple of days. What might be some metrics to measure the effectiveness of a regulator? We've talked about national level metrics, sector level metrics like schools with education, internet connections, colleges with online education, and so on. How do you measure how good a regulator is? If you can even compare them, what kinds of metrics would you use?
So I think we need to think about a regulatory index. I think the idea a few years ago was raised in Europe, and I think it's the European Regulatory Association had an index, to measure the effectiveness of regulators, and of course that index was based on a lot of parameters, including the effectiveness of regulations that were taken, the application of competition law, the penetration rate in all the market. So I think what will help in Africa is really if such an index can be set up. I said earlier that in my view it's important that the regulators also benchmark themselves and see if what they are doing is really in the interest of the customers and ultimately of the market. So in my view, it will be good to have such an index. It's an idea that we have already raised. But it would be good if regulators are here, if such an index could be set up maybe through the different instances, regional or continental instances.
I suppose calculating the metric or determining what the basis is going to be the hardest, but I would say that especially from a regulatory perspective and for them to be a lot more proactive, one would look for some metric that evaluates the impact of their regulation on industry growth, on innovation, and obviously on consumer welfare, and to be seen if that's a positive or a negative.
Thank you. Actually, I'm aware that UNCDF, they have this such a similar index, but of course it's looking at digital economy. But one of the pillars that they're looking at is policy issues, and another one is ICT. And this is so far, it has been used, it covers around 25 countries. And also they're looking at, we are looking at them to customize it to in the Zanzibar context. So the matrix can be, an index can be created, but the key issue is that the usage, how effective is it going to be on the shelf, or the government are really going to accept it and use it? So in case of this UNCDF IDS tool, Zambia and Uganda, they use it very much in making the decision, to make different policies issues. So in Tanzania, it's in the map, and then the question is how maybe it needs more acceptance and ownership from the government, so for it to have a real life implication instead of just being a tool that gives a good picture. Yes. Thank you.
I believe we need to set the stage now for the closing ceremony. So I want to thank all our speakers here for a very provocative discussion on regulatory index, on incentives for regulation, on benchmarking across the region, across other parts of the world, and so on. So once again, thank you so much for your insights. Thanks to the audience for your questions. Please do be seated. We just need to clear the stage and the front row for our dignitaries. So once again.